My name is Tuma Young, and I'm an assistant professor here at Breton University in the Indigenous Studies department. A very common perspective from Indigenous folks is that we don't pay a tax and we shouldn't have to pay a tax, and that taxation is a form of imposition by the colonial government that is ongoing. In fact, some Indigenous folks would make the argument that tax exemption is an Aboriginal right or a treaty right, not realizing that many of the exemptions are actually statutory based. Taxation, when you think about it from an Indigenous perspective, the contemporary approach to it is that it's seen as something that is a foreign concept, or that it is through the lens of the statute exemptions. But from a lot of Indigenous people, they view taxation as being something that's been imposed upon them by the outside community, and that there's commentary that there was no form of taxation before. However, if you go back into Indigenous perspectives of taxation, other types of redistribution were used. Well, the terminology redistributive economy, I take it to mean resources are redistributed among the whole community, and that would not be a foreign concept to many Indigenous communities, especially among the Mi'kmaq. What that in essence means is that people would be sharing the resources, and that doesn't necessarily mean there would not be management of the resources. There was always management of the resources, but there was the concept of sharing the resources would be at the foundation of any redistributive economy. For example, one of the things that pops into my mind is the story of the Grand Chief. A Grand Chief normally would not be the one hunting, but the folks in the community would bring the Grand Chief and his family food, materials, anything that they needed to live on. And in return, the Grand Chief provided leadership, and commentary or anything that they required from a leader. And one of the things that roles of a leader was to provide services when they were needed. Often the Grand Chief would be asked to be the foster parent of orphans, or that they would take in widowed families. So early on in history, what you would see is historical writers would be talking about the Grand Chief having many wives, and wondering and saying that this was a patrilineal society, and there was multiple wives. When from the Mi'kmaq perspective, this was not true. It would be that the Grand Chief had one wife, but over time would become responsible for providing for widows and orphans that were naturally brought into his camp. And so the redistributive economy would be the other hunters would realize that this is the service provided by the Grand Chief and his family, and would allocate part of the hunt to the Grand Chief, so that the Grand Chief was able to feed, provide, clothe, and nurture the large extended family that he had, without the need for hunting. In return, that he had to provide governance services and advisory services to the community. Well, in some ways, the whole purpose of a taxation is that you would use people's time or units of time as expressed in resources, which would be money, predominantly money today, and that's really what you're relying on, is that the labor of folks as expressed in the units of time, in currency. So in this exchange takes place to be given over to a governing body, and that the community themselves benefit from larger projects that the governing body would be able to do. For example, people pay a tax to provide for roads, hospitals, and other essential government services. The redistributive economy that many indigenous communities use and face acted in a similar vein. The hunters would provide part of the hunt to elders, to widows, to orphans, to others, So really, essentially, it was they would be dividing up their units of time, not necessarily expressed through money, but through actual resources like wood, food, skills, and everything that were provided to all of the community. So the foundation is the same. It's just that in the contemporary society and modern society as today, those units of time, of the person's labor, is now expressed through currency. The overall impact cannot be separated from the impact of colonization. The overall economy of First Nations communities have been devastated by the impact of colonization. So to rebuild the foundation and to make it into self-sustaining and one that can implement a type of redistributive economy or a taxation approach is going to require a significant amount of work and possibly transfer of capital from other government bodies such as Canada. With that in mind, the big issue really is how to rebuild the indigenous economies. In some ways, this work had started in the 1850s, at which time there was a minimum amount of Unama'ki people left because of the epidemics and poverty, imposition of poverty. And then as the Unama'ki community started to bounce back from all of that, along with all other communities in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada and in Canada as a result of Confederation and the industrialization sector, the Great Depression hit. And along with the Great Depression, you had other social ills that came about, for example, racism. So the Unama'ki folks who were working in labor relations or labor intensive organizations, such as coal mining, coopering, or fishing, or natural resources, what happened then is that they were the first to be let go. And as elders have pointed out, the men and women who were working after the Great Depression were never hired back. And then subsequently other impacts of colonization intersected and were put on top of the Great Depression. And were in some ways, one elder quoted, that I can quote here, said to us when we were studying this issue, he said, "We've never recovered from the Great Depression." And that kind of explains the situation in many Indigenous communities right now. The economies were never built back up. There was no, even after the war, there was the Marshall Plan for rebuilding Europe, everything. There was no Marshall Plan for rebuilding Indigenous economies. And as such, we're now faced with that issue. How do we make Indigenous communities or Unama'ki communities into a self-sustaining, productive economies when the foundational base is just not there? When the concept of taxation first came up, I thought to myself, we must have had something like that. And so in looking at the history books and historical accounts, we did. It's the term that's used now today is redistributive economies, yes. The concept of sharing and everything like this. So I look back in our language and I say, well, there are several terms that immediately pop into my head and what can be termed as a form of taxation, but not in that sense. In ways, you have to look at it from a different perspective. Well, the first one is Unama'ki, we all help each other to survive and to thrive. That Unama'ki, And so when you use that term, people understand it very clearly what's intended and what's needed. Pooling of or sharing of resources or skills or anything like that to basically to help each other to bring everybody all up. The other one would be a type of nudugulimk, which is called provisioning or hunting. People say, well, that's how you would go. You go and hunt what you only need, but it's a little bit more than that. It's you gather enough for everyone, and so it's not just for your immediate family, but you also, if you're hunting for something, or like if you catch a moose, a young man catches a moose, often that young man didn't even get a part of the moose. That was all divided up and given to the whole community, and his family would be the last. And in my family, it was almost similar. My father was a very expert fisherman. He fished trout, salmon, everything and stuff. But we often went without fish. And I asked one time, and I said, on the way home, my father would see another family that needed to fish more, so he would gladly give that up. And so that follows the concept of nudugulimk, the provisioning. It's not, people often mistake it to be limited by you just take what you need, but what you need should be enough for everyone. In one way, yes, but in a larger sense, no. Taxation is often seen as a requirement, a legislative impact that you are required to contribute. And sometimes folks this will breed a type of resentment. And the often quoted is like, taxation is the art of plucking the most feathers from the goose with the least amount of hissing. Whereas in indigenous redistributive economies, it was purely a voluntarily, what you would call it, from the heart and the sharing of resources. The hunter would never even think, and thus there would be no resentment or never any hissing. That would be the overall goal. But with the imposition of poverty in the 1800s and 1500s, we heard stories about how folks were so poor that they could not share, and rather than show their faces when they're unable to share, they would rather hide and just leave the pot there for whoever's passing there, realizing that they could not share, their food or anything like that. So that, to me, is the primary difference. In the contemporary societies such as Canada and today, the structure of taxation often leads, people know that we need to do it and we need to pay for services that the government provides and everything like this, but often there's an underlying resentment or a reluctance to do so. Whereas in the indigenous redistributive economy or Unama'ki, that resentment, that foundation is not there. Well, for a lot of folks, when you mention traditional indigenous business, they often picture the crafts or basket making crafts, beadwork or leatherwork or anything like that. But I look back on it and say, business is not a foreign concept for many, many indigenous communities. In fact, many indigenous communities were engaging in business and trades and transactions long before contact. There's lots of stories about history of trading, the history of trade. Here in Atlantic Canada, we know that our communities were trading fish and sending it down to the Boston agricultural-based indigenous communities to use as fertilizer for their corn, and their corn would be sent back up here. So there was large-scale trade going on already. And when the French and the English first made contact with the communities, these societies, Mi'kmaq societies and Unama'ki societies, were very, very they were very much aware of how trade works, and that was the number one thing they came into. So in some ways you can look at it from an international trade aspect of it. Fish were traded, skins were traded. The beginnings of the fur trade actually resulted in a type of a middle ground where both the Unnu and the colonizers both benefited from the exchange of trades and technology and for natural resources. The Europeans wanted fur for the fashion houses in Europe, and the Unnus had access to it, and they wanted or quickly adapted to technology that was the new technology that was being brought in. In some ways, that's no different than the young folks today of using smartphones and adapting to technology and the internet, and how do you incorporate this into trade? So trade and business is not a foreign concept for indigenous peoples. What has been devastating is early on in many indigenous communities, the center of the economy, or the leader of the economy, was the woman who ran the household. But with the French and English and the patriarchal attitudes toward, and especially among the missionaries, they refused to believe that a woman can be an economic force, and they refused to deal with them. And so in the background, the men would come up with the resource, and then the women would be doing the trading. But under later on, after the middle ground was established, the French and English took away that woman's role, and over time, the women's role in economics was diminished and severely impacted by colonization. And then once the foundation was pulled away from the economies, that the basis of the land, there are many, many petitions over years and years of Unnu people saying, we want the land back. And this was the rallying cry back in the 1700s and the 1800s and in the 1900s too, and still is today. Because business and a successful economy, and per se a successful tax scheme or taxation scheme, depends on a solid economic foundation, and we don't have that right now. But generally speaking, business is not a foreign concept to indigenous people. They're actually quite experts at it.